there?
We're ready to start the meeting when you would like to.
There's only one of me right now, so.
So we're waiting for a quorum.
Hold on, I'm gonna be right back. Who else is here?
Councilmember Friedman. Yeah, go.
Hello.
The other two are coming right now. They were just in their
finance
offices.
staff. Yeah, we have a few finance staff that'll be presenting today, as well as the departments. So I think a full house today.
Okay, so as soon as my colleagues come on, I'll have the roll call done, Ms. Corman. And then we'll get going.
Perfect.
Okay, and we'll wait for Alejandra. Morning, Councilmember
Sorry, I
Harmon.
thought this started at 12:30. I apologize.
Originally it did, but we moved it up.
My apologies.
And committee staff, Brandon Bodette will be running this. I will be in the background doing webinar magic.
See if Councilmember Gutierrez is on yet.
Not yet.
Okay. I'll give it one more minute and then I'll start it.
Councilman Freeman, just so you're aware, we have like 6 or 7 departments presenting on the first item. So I'll step in and just kind of introduce them so you don't have to continuously pop in.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm gonna call the meeting to order. Ms. Clerk, if you could do the roll call, please.
Yes, and Ms. Councilmember Gutierrez, Alejandra Gutierrez has just joined us also. So, Chair Friedman,
Present.
Councilmember Gutierrez,
Present.
and Councilmember Harmon.
Here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So the meeting of the May 12th Finance Committee is called to order. So on the first part of the agenda, I will call for any public comment not related to any items on the agenda. Is there any public comment, Madam Clerk?
No, there is not.
Okay, thank you. So item 1 is the Finance Committee review of the fiscal year 21 recommended budget. And I will turn it over to Mr. Bodette, and then the accompanying staff will give presentations for this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. So today we will be continuing our review of the fiscal year 21 recommended budget. Today we have the fee changes proposed for next year, and today will be specifically enterprise funds related. So we have 6 or 7 departments here to present to you today for those. So we'll start with the airport department, who will come on and present.
Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deanna Zackerson. I'm the Business Development Manager for the airport, and I'm going to be joined here today by Aaron Keller, operations manager, to talk just about a couple of proposed fee changes for the coming fiscal year. And if we can go to the next slide, they are changes to our daily parking rates and then some changes to our ground transportation rates, which specifically have to do with the transportation network companies, Uber and Lyft. But first, daily parking rates at the airport. You can move to the next slide. So we have three types of parking at the airport. We have short-term parking, which is the closest into the terminal, currently at $20 a day. We have long-term parking at the terminal, which is still in pretty close proximity, but just a bit further away, at $13 a day. And then we have our economy lot, which is located off of Hollister Avenue and requires a shuttle to go into the terminal. We've currently discontinued that as a cost-saving measure and because of lack of demand. But when we're busy, we do have that economy lot available. So next slide. So we are proposing two changes. One is an increase to the rate in our short-term parking. And that's, again, as close to the terminal as you can possibly get. This area is really designed for short stays of 30 minutes to an hour for people dropping off and picking up. We want to see a lot of turnover in that lot. And so we price it so as to really encourage people coming in and out for short stays. We'd like to increase this to discourage long-term use in that lot because it is somewhat limited as compared to our other lots. And we've also had some issues with employees that have actually come to work and paid to park in that lot and go to work. And of course, then taking up a space all day long that is really not intended for that purpose. So that tells us that we need to price our product just a little bit higher in order to discourage that. So we think coming up to $25 a day will accomplish that. And next slide. Oh, I think we're missing a slide here. Okay, so we can back up. We'll go back here. There's one slide that I have here that you guys don't seem to have, and that has to do with the long-term parking. That is at $13 a day currently. We'd like to raise that to $15 a day, pretty modest increase. And that's really based on that we have, we benchmark to other comparable airports nearby, and our rate has been historically somewhat low. And so we'd like to increase that to $15 a day. We last increased that rate back in 2017, and it had no negative impact to demand whatsoever. So let's go to the next slide. So revenue impact. This is one of those where our forecasts pre-COVID-19 have very little relation to the current situation. In other words, we have very little demand for parking at the moment. We do expect that to change, though, eventually. We expect that we would see, even though we would have fewer transactions in the next coming fiscal year, we would still see a moderate increase in revenue due to increasing these rates somewhat. And the reason for that is that parking, airport parking, just traditionally is not a very price-sensitive product. Consumers make their choices with regard to parking on other factors other than on the price of parking. And these are still actually very reasonable rates. So, and then of course, when demand returns, we will bring back our $10 a day option. And therefore we'll have a nice set of options for folks at different price points and different levels of convenience. So with that, I think I can pass to Aaron Keller.
All right. Good afternoon, council members and all. I am here to speak with you today about ground transportation rates. This is a continuation of the council ordinance that was passed in June of 2017 that really require private companies to pay for the privilege to operate out of the airport. We created this fee structure, and it won't just affect TNCs. However, TNCs, and when I say TNCs, I'm referring to the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. They bring in the majority of our ground transportation revenue. However, we do have some other fees that will be adjusted for other prearranged services, which I'll have for you in one of the following slides that provides the entire fee structure that we're proposing. Right now, what we're charging is $2.75 per passenger for pickup only. And the adjustment that we're seeking is that this would also, if you'd advance to the next slide, please, this would also cover drop-offs as well. Go to the next slide, please. So current industry practice is to charge for both pickups and drop-offs curbside at an airport. We've surveyed, and approximately 75 to 80% of surveys do have this sort of fee structure. And it's going to continue to have the $2.75 pickup and drop-off fee. We're not looking for an increase, just looking to add drop-offs. When we start to get up to the $4 or $5 pickup or drop-off fee, that's where we generally see the corporations start to push back, and our fee is very modest. We're just looking to recoup for the facility use on the drop-off as well. Business users' fees offset the cost for us to maintain the ground transportation operation. As you'll recall, frequently we'll have security guards out front that are ushering vehicles along to maintain that valuable curb space for us. We also provide some additional services for them in that we maintain a staging area with restroom facilities and trash removal, things of that nature. So that is what we're looking to accomplish here. So you could advance to the next slide, please. So this is the overall fee structure that we're looking at. And if you recall from the previous time this was presented, what we've adjusted here is simply we've added pickup or drop off at the top for each type of transportation mode you see on the left. And then we also eliminated the pickup or drop off fee for the ride shares located at the bottom, quite simply because we don't have the technology, and nor do they have the technology in place to determine what that fee structure would be based like for 10 or more passengers. What we see with Ubers and Lyfts, for example, they're primarily personal vehicles that would never exceed the 10 passenger limit anyway. So therefore we felt it was appropriate to make that adjustment as well. Next slide, please. So just to summarize here, what kind of money are we, or revenues rather, are we talking about? Specific to the TNCs, as I shared with you, they are the majority of our ground transportation revenues, at least that mode of travel is. We were projected to receive about $270,000 in FY20 with the pickup fees only. As we were discussing this initial proposal, quite simply doubling down on that, we could see a fee increase of, or I'm sorry, a revenue increase of over $500,000 to help plug some of the gaps that we're experiencing. However, I have to throw this out there, you know, post-COVID-19, how many people are going to want to get back into the TNCs? Or how many people are going to want to ride in a taxi, for example, if they have a personal car available? That may create a spike in parking demand. We also have rental cars. So we're trying to look for the best way to come out on the other side of this, knowing that the passengers will adjust the way that they operate when they start to return to the facility. So being that we estimated about 50% on parking, we also felt it was fair to estimate about 50% of our anticipated revenue for FY21. So we're hoping that we'll be able to bring in about $270,000 in revenue if this proposed fee schedule is adopted. And with that, I believe that takes care of our slides. If there are any questions for us, otherwise we're happy to step back.
Any questions from my colleagues on the council? Hearing none. I'll hold public comment till the very end for all the items after everyone's presented, if there is anybody from the public who wants to speak to these.
Okay, we'll step back. Thank you very much.
So next we will hear from the Downtown Parking Fund.
Good afternoon, Rob Dayton, representing Public Works and Downtown Parking. We just have 5 things we're recommending it being adjusted. These were also recommended by your Downtown Parking Committee and forwarded to you by them as well. The first one is in the downtown parking system, we have a lot of back of house trash bins that we accommodate. And we're having a big struggle with people making sure, the business owners making sure that they're clean and left closed and locked. So we're proposing to up the expense on the instance where there's a cleaning that's needed for those individual sites. It is a rather expensive proposition for our staff to do that ourselves. And then proposing the second one, eliminating a fee for construction. Multi-day construction happens in our system frequently. We do not need to have the deposit on hand. We just have not been collecting it. And we do charge construction revenue per space taken up on a daily basis. So that fee is certainly adequate for that. And then on the 24/7 parking permits, this is in preparation for housing that would happen downtown, and someone who would want to, a resident who's downtown who would want to have their vehicle stored in the parking system. So it's we're not calling it a housing permit, we're calling it a 24/7 permit to really talk about the time that someone would want to have their vehicle in there. That's $250 per month. Just to give you an example, the next highest monthly employee permit that we give is $160 in the Granada garage and the Canna Perdido garages. Next slide. And then some changes for our holidays. Holidays is a time that we balance our need for the employees to have time off, and then also to balance the number of shifts that we have. On holidays, we have only one shift. We're proposing to drop the Martin Luther King Day from that because the film festival requires a lot more hand-holding with people. So we're proposing to drop that day. And then also in hourly rates, this is kind of an interesting discussion that we've been having with Downtown Parking Committee. You see in the current is the hours that we actually charge the fee structure to be hourly parking in our system. We're proposing to go 24 hours a day in that. So it'd be in a closed loop system. The gate would be down all the time. And so when a kiosketeer is not in the kiosk, the gate would be down. It would be credit card to get out. And then we would have services for that 24-hour period in case someone needed to get out in the middle of the night and they could not get out. That is in concert with the 24/7 permit as well, starting to introduce vehicles in the parking systems 24 hours. We do have a lot of parkers who take advantage to wait till after hours and then leave. So you could actually be in the parking system all day long. And then after the kiosketeer leaves, you could leave the system and have free parking. So that will also take care of the few people who are doing that so that they'll be charged for their time in the facility. And that is the end of our changes. Be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from my colleagues? I do have a question, Mr. Dayton, on the Martin Luther King parking. I just want to understand, is the current is that it's closed, if I understand, and then so now it would be staffed and there would be a charge on that day?
The holiday staffing is on holidays. Is 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's an abbreviated amount. What the times we're closed is New Year's Day, Easter Sunday, Thanksgiving, Christmas Day, and then holiday parades after certain times. So the holiday schedule is really about our employees and them working less on those specific days.
Okay, so Martin Luther King would still be a normal day then?
It would be a normal day of operation with 2 shifts.
Okay, that's what I. And then on the 24-hour hourly rates, has there been any discussion about businesses and the recovery that we're going to be expecting, and just trying to get people downtown, and would this discourage some of that as we're reopening? I just have a concern that that if we start charging other rates, that it might discourage people from coming down, especially in the evenings once there is a reopening. So can you speak to that at all? Because I do have a concern about charging rates all into the night, and it might discourage people from coming back downtown.
Yes, Councilmember Freeman, there's very few people who park all night long. So we're talking about affecting a very, very few people, but you're right. We will have to have a conversation, and we plan on having a conversation with council about how do we reopen the parking system in a way that is good for downtown, still inviting. The thing to always keep in mind with the downtown parking system is it's not geared for employees, it's geared for customers. So when downtown starts regenerating activity, normally what we'll see is the employees will use the lots if they remain free, and then, or at reduced rates. And then it does tend to crowd out customer parking. So that's something we always have to balance with the downtown Santa Barbara, and working with them and our customers to make sure that we're meeting their needs. And it's going to take some strategic hand-holding.
And in this case, it would only be from after 11 on Sunday through Thursday. I'm looking at it, and after 2 Friday and Saturday, so it would be a smaller number. The last question I have, because it's come up from some members of the public, is looking at extending the free parking from 75 in the downtown to possibly 90 or even further. Has there been any discussion of that at all?
No, not at all. We have not been talking about that. And as a matter of fact, what you'll see when we get to council on budget is that we're going to be projecting a 25% reduction in revenues for next year. And so we've got some ways to deal with that, but reducing fees is probably not one of them. And then we're going to have to, which would happen if you lengthen the free period. One of the things that's really important to understand is that 60% of all our tickets are free. So the predominant amount of people are using that free system. And then we do have some employees that are what's called the 75-minute shuffle. They use the free period and then move to a different lot. But we'll be talking to the council about the projections and that we see and measures to accommodate those revenues so that we don't get upside down on the business model.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions from my colleagues. So Mr. Bodette, who's up next?
Thank you.
So next we will hear from the Golf Fund.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and committee members. I'm Nicole Parmalee, I'm the business manager for Parks and Recreation, and today I'll be presenting the fee proposals for the Golf Fund for fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. So there are many factors we always consider when evaluating the fee structure at the golf course, including how to best maximize participation, making sure that we're pricing in such a way to capture those particular target markets that we're really looking to attract and expand, as well as offering fees that are competitive with the local market and also providing a benefit to the community, while at the same time allowing us to recapture those cost increases that we continue to see year over year, including rising minimum wage and water rates, as well as just sort of meeting our overall operational and capital needs. And then this year, of course, we have the added dimension of changing and somewhat uncertain economic conditions that we have to factor in. So we want to make sure that we're not putting forward any fee increases that the market will not or cannot support at this time. Next slide, please. So in order to provide the best value golf experience, we offer a variety of discounted pricing options, including the ones that you can see here on the screen. So resident discounts, for example, are typically about 30% lower than the non-resident rate. We also offer some really great low rates for juniors, young adults, students, as well as seniors and some other folks. Next slide, please. So in fiscal year 21 and moving forward, we are, first of all, proposing moving all fee increases to start in July to align with the beginning of the fiscal year and to streamline our fee structure in line with our other department and city operations. Previously, At the golf course, the fee increases have been done in January, and that was to coincide with some other local courses. But in consultation with the management company, we don't foresee any issue with moving the increases to July. We expect this to capture about an additional $16,000 in revenue in the first 6 months of the next fiscal year, which will be particularly helpful as the course is, rebounding from the 5 weeks that it was closed due to the pandemic. And then the exception to this will be the programming fees for junior golf instruction in camps, which will still be charged in January to align with the start of the camp season. So overall, we have very minimal proposed fee changes for this year, and they're all included here on the screen. We have the standard $1 increase on greens fees, as well as driving range increases of 50 cents on the medium bucket and $1 on the large bucket. And then in January, Russ Morrison Junior Golf Program fees are proposed to increase from $85 for either the spring or the fall session to $90, so a $5 increase. And then for the full year, it would increase by $10 from $140 to $150, which is still an excellent value considering that it's about approximately 51 hours of instruction for the full year program, so it's less than $3 an hour. And then similarly, junior golf camps are proposed to increase from $160 to $170 for a 5-day camp. Overall, most of the fees will be staying the same, and we do not anticipate any impact from these changes, as greens fees and programming are still a great value in comparing with other local competition. Next slide, please. And you can just see here at a glance, when comparing on this slide our weekday resident rates to some of the other local courses, Santa Barbara Golf Club remains among the most affordable in most or all categories, which is the top line that you can see there. And then next slide, please. And similarly with weekend rates, which is shown on this slide, Santa Barbara Golf Club is still very competitive and represents great value. So you can see how it compares to the other local competition. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Any questions from my colleagues? Thank you, Ms. Parmalee. Just to say, my kids participated in the Russ Morrison golf 2 summers ago, and it was a great time you have them out there, and it's a great program and very affordable for the level of instruction that they got. So just want to thank all the workers out at the golf course. Hearing none from my colleagues, Mr. Bodette, you're up.
So next we have water and wastewater funds.
Yes, thank you, Chair Friedman, members of the committee, Malcolm Hamilton, Administrative Analyst in the Water Resources Division, here today to go over briefly the proposed fee changes for water and wastewater in fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. For water, we're proposing a 3% increase for the majority of our service fees, and the intention there is to track the inflationary cost increases, largely for staffing and materials. We are proposing one new fee. However, this is for an existing service, so we're not currently recuperating the cost for that service, and we'd like to. We also have a couple specific revisions outside of the 3% general increase, a couple decreases, and something a little larger than 3%. And I'll get into more detail about that in a couple slides. And then lastly, for water, we're updating a methodology for estimating meter reads, which is not a common occurrence, but we think we have a way to make it, to simplify the estimations and make it more intuitive for customers. And then likewise for wastewater, we're doing 3% service fee increases, again, for the large majority of all fees. There is an exception there though. Recently we've come to City Council and made changes to our sewer lateral rehabilitation fees. That's section 3 of the fee schedule, and we're not proposing any changes there as that was done just recently. Next slide, please. So we are proposing the new fee, which is the supplemental backflow inspection fee. A backflow device is a device that prevents water from re-entering the water distribution system from the fire line. So you may have stagnant water in the fire line. You don't want that re-entering the water distribution system. So these backflow devices prevent that from happening. Currently, when customers pay the standard service fee, city staff goes out 3 different times to ensure that the device was installed properly and the sanitation is done correctly. There's instances though where contractors have not correctly prepared the fire lines for sanitation testing. And so our staff has to come out, and that anywhere from 1 additional time to 6 additional times at the very worst. We're providing that service right now, that additional site visit free of charge, but we'd like to implement a fee to recuperate the cost of having staff time and the truck equipment cost to go out there and perform the site visit. That's estimated at $126 per visit. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're doing a couple specific fee revisions outside of the 3% increase. So for water distribution inspection fees, we're actually going to be lowering that fee from $236 per visit to $126 per visit. We have been performing that service with 2 staff members, and we're going to be going down to just performing that service with 1 staff member in fiscal year 21. And also hydrant flow tests. So we've been working on getting better data from our asset management system based on some work order data that we were able to pull. The hydrant flow test service is requiring more staff time than initially estimated, and the average labor rate are also higher than we had estimated. So that will be increasing from $335 for a flow test to $497. Next slide. And finally here, I had mentioned that we will be updating how we estimate meter reads. So it's not a common occurrence, but it can happen when a meter is inaccessible, or in the very rare case when meters are malfunctioning, we have to estimate a read for a customer for 1 month. We plan on simplifying the estimating methodology. We think this will also improve accuracy, and we'll be using for the estimates the most recent successful read on a meter. We also think this is going to improve communication with our customers. If you take a look at the bottom of this slide, you can see the strikeout version of what we were using previously, and it was a little bit of a nuanced system-wide average approach for different seasons of the year and by meter size, and that wasn't always as accurate as we wanted, and it wasn't always as easy to communicate as we wanted to customers. So we'll simply just be using the last good meter read, and if it's determined later on that the estimate was high, we'll adjust that down and provide a credit to customers. And that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from my colleagues? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Hamilton. And Mr. Baudet, who's up next?
So our last enterprise fund today will be the Waterfront Fund.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and Finance Committee members. My name is Brian Bossy. I'm the Waterfront Business Manager, and I'm here today to present to you our proposed fee adjustments for fiscal year 2021. As far as background, these were presented last year as part of our 2-year budget. More recently, we presented these to the City Administrator and Finance Department staff back on February 24th. And then 2 days after that, we presented it to our Harbor Commission Budget Subcommittee on February 26th. So as far as our proposed adjustments for the coming fiscal year, we have 3. And if I can back up a little bit, every year we conduct a survey of 18 different public and private marinas up and down the coast of California, from Santa Cruz on the north to Oceanside Harbor on the south. And we do this for a number of reasons. One, to keep in touch with our colleagues, but also to see where we fit with our fees. And every year, resoundingly, we are at the lower end as far as fees are concerned. We are a very user-friendly marina, and it seems to work. So with that, our first proposed first proposed fee adjustment is our slip rental fee. We're proposing to increase that by 2%. And I'll get into what that means in a dollar and cents type discussion in my next slide. So that's our slip rental fee, a 2% increase. We've been doing this for about the last 10 years. Our next proposed fee adjustment would be our slip permit transfer fee. And this is when people come in and out of our different slips. We have 1,143 slips. And what we're proposing is to add $25 per foot to the current rate for fiscal year 2021. And so currently that rate is $500 per foot, and we will be moving that to $525. Please note that that does not include the 20, 25 foot, 28 foot, or 30 foot slips. Those are already frozen. And then it doesn't include our designated commercial fishing berths. And then lastly is our West Beach rack permit. We're proposing an adjustment of $50 increase. So that is currently at $1,150, and that would be moved to $1,200. So in terms of how the 2% increase works out, thank you. Here's a quick chart. So if you have a 20-foot slip and you're changing that, increasing that rate by 2%, that's going to add up to an additional $3.60 on your monthly bill. 35 foot going down the list adds $7.35. And then if you get up towards your larger boats, a 60-foot boat, that's an added $15 per month to your slip fee. So again, we go up and down the coast, look at what different marinas are charging, and we are always towards the lower end. Again, very user-friendly, very cost-effective. And these fees are gotten to the point where people are accustomed to that and almost expected. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the waterfront proposed fee adjustments for fiscal year 2021.
Thank you, Mr. Bossi. This brings me back to my days on the Harbor Commission with you, gosh, almost a decade ago in some case, when I first started. Any questions from my colleagues on waterfront or any of these? Hearing none, is there any public comment, Madam Clerk?
No, Chair, there's not.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bossi and Mr. Baudet. So I will close item 1 and move on to item 2, which is the March 31st, 2020 investment report and fiscal agent reports. And Mr. Priya, it's all you.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman and committee members Harmon and Gutierrez. My name is Salvatore Parilla, finance analyst at the city of Santa Barbara. My role at the city is to help ensure the smooth functioning of the city's investment program. And today I'll take the opportunity to give you an overview of our quarterly investments and also go over some main areas that factor into our investment program. Next slide, please. I will be touching on 4 main areas: the investment policy overview, the current interest rate environment and long-term trends, the city's investment strategy, and ultimately the quarterly investments performance and in comparison with the benchmarks that the city utilizes. Next slide, please. Moving on to the investment policy. So the city of Santa Barbara does have an investment policy in place that is presented by staff on an annual basis to council for review and approval. And what the investment policy is it serves as a guide for the correct functioning of our investment program. It defines clear rules such as which investments are allowed, internal controls, best practices, and also sets benchmarks to compare the investment portfolio performance to. It ultimately can help protect the city's investment assets, and it enhances transparency and disclosures by allowing staff and the elected officials to share their fiduciary duties toward the investment funds. Next slide, please. you can actually find the investment policy published on the investment program webpage located on the City of Santa Barbara website. Next slide, please. Moving on to the current interest rate environment, you might have heard of the unprecedented moves that occurred in the markets starting pretty much in March. The Federal Reserve indeed cut interest rates by 1.5% back in March, bringing the current Fed funds rate to a range of 0 to 0.25. Why is the Fed funds rate so important? The Fed funds rate, in a nutshell, is the benchmark interest rate that controlled by the Federal Reserve that determines the flow of capital and the cost of money in an economy. So every time that the Federal Reserve either hikes or cuts interest rates, there are major consequences, of course, in the real economy. So why did the Federal Reserve take such an aggressive action, an unprecedented action? That was prompted by, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic that could have caused and probably will, in certain measures, illiquidity markets, higher unemployment, and also risks of deflation. Next slide. So this table actually shows you, if you look on the left-hand side, it shows you the Treasury by terms from 3 months through 30 years. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the cumulative change across the board on the yield curve reflects that 1.5% rate cut that the Federal Reserve performed. In fact, you can see that since the end of last quarter, or the previous quarter, excuse me, ending in December to the last quarter ending in March, you can see the drastic drop in interest rates. Next slide, please. To reinforce that, you can look at this chart. This chart shows you the yield curve today in comparison with where it was a year ago. So the blue line is actually the yield curve last year, and it was across the board around 2.5%. While if you look at the red line, that's today's yield curve, and you can see the drop visually due to the pandemic. Next slide, please. To add more context to that, if you look at this rainbow chart, it shows you the terms from 1 month to 30 years in the last 3 years of the yield curve terms. So you can see that two things stands out on this chart. If you look at the period where you see the peak in October 2018, that indicates that the economy was still in an expansionary mode. While, as you can see today on the right-hand side, in March 2020, interest rates have pretty much effectively dropped to zero, reflecting the reality that the economy is currently in a contraction. Next slide, please. And lastly, this is a 65-year look back at the Fed funds rate. As you can see, there are two highlights on this chart. So the gray shaded lines are the actual recessions that occurred in the American economy in the last 65 years. The peak of the blue line that you see around the 1980s, that's where when inflation was well over 20%. And the inevitable and drastic drop that you see up until today indicates pretty much a new environment with lower inflation and a lower Fed funds rate to reflect that. Next slide, please. So moving on to the city's investment strategy. So what's the city's investment strategy? The city has a very conservative investment approach, and the primary objectives are safety first, and then liquidity and yield. For safety, what does that mean? That means preservation of capital, so not lose money primarily. Then comes the liquidity, which means to ensure that the city has enough liquidity to fulfill the operational and capital expenditures needs. And ultimately, the city has a goal to earn some interest on the money that get invested. To do so, the city buys into the market. So the investment is not to chase yields. That way, the city avoids harsh fluctuations that might occur in the markets at different times. One tool that the city utilizes to help with the planning of the investment strategy is actually a maturity ladder, which is spread over a 5-year period. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can actually see a sample of the maturity ladder that is utilized at the city. On the top portion of this table, you can see the calendar years, and at the bottom in blue, those are the fiscal years. So the figures, the dollar figures that you see inside this table are the expected redemptions that our investment portfolio has throughout different months and different years. So what the maturity ladder allows the city to do is 2 main points. One is to pretty much put in place a system that allows liquidity to come in when needs arise. And then second, allows an efficient planning of the reinvestments in the investment portfolio. Next slide, please.
Councilmember Harmon, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Thank you so much. This is so interesting to me. I don't totally understand the maturity ladder. Sorry, can we go back to the maturity ladder? Sorry, so if I'm understanding you correctly, Mr. Parilla, this gives us what we can get liquid in an sort of what's available like in month 2 of 2020 or whatever. And what's the bottom line of this chart? Like, what is the amount that we have available to us that's liquid? I guess I don't quite understand. And I don't need you to go into the details about the chart. That's way over my head, but can you give me sort of the bottom line number that I should be looking at in this chart?
Absolutely, Committee Member Harmon. Thanks for the question. So what you see here is, I'll give you an example. If you point to the April 2020 figure, that 8 million indicates that according to current market conditions, the city is expecting $8 million in investments to come back to the city in the form of cash, because the investment vehicles that the city invested in are coming to maturity. So that ladder pretty much tells you, okay, it tells you the time frame and also the amount of liquidity that is going to be available to the city on a to-go basis according to the investments that we made in the past.
Okay, and is there some, so I imagine, and you may have already covered this, so I'm sorry, but I imagine typically when it comes to these returns, we would reinvest them. Is there some deadline by which we need to say we're not going to reinvest them? Or how are we dealing with in April when we get this or see that we have these 8 million liquid? Who makes the determination that we're going to keep that cash rather than reinvest it?
This is another great question. So we do have discretion on making the decision to reinvest or not the funds that come back to the city. And of course, that decision is dictated by current market conditions, but primarily by the liquidity needs that the city has. As I will outline in future slides, you can actually see that the city currently has a very conservative approach aimed at raising as much cash as possible to withstand the uncertainty that COVID-19 presents to the city.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So moving on to the next slide. This is actually a snapshot of the investment portfolio, the city's investment portfolio at the end of March 2020. As you can see, the first two lines, the Union Bank checking account and the state of California local agency investment funds, that's the liquid portion of the city's investment portfolio. And for liquid, I mean immediately deployable as needed. The rest of the investment vehicles that you see on the other lines, like CDs, treasury securities, or corporate notes, those have longer maturities, but they can, of course, be redeemed as needed. Next slide, please. This slide is actually a visual of the composition of the city's investment portfolio. Two things stand out, and this is, going back to committee member Harmon's question. 42% of the portfolio is currently in cash. If you look at the Union Bank checking account and LAIF portion. And also what this slide shows is how diversified the portfolio is. Next slide, please. Which takes me to the quarterly performance for the quarter ending in March 2020. So the portfolio yield was 1.9% approximately. And that translates in a dollar figure of $962,000 in interest income earnings. About 20% of that, or 197,000, was the general fund portion. And at the end of March 31st, the total cash and investments for the city, the amount was $198 million. Which was slightly down from the $205 million recorded at the end of December 31st, 2019. Next slide, please. Speaking about benchmark rates, so this is a chart that shows the last 20 years moves of our investment portfolio performance. Compared to the 2-year Treasury and the LAIF rate, which the city utilizes as benchmarks because they match the 2.5-year maturity limit that the city has per investment policy. As you can see, the blue line indicates the portfolio rate, and while the green line is the state LAIF, and the red line represents the 2-year Treasury. As you can see in March 2020, you see the drastic drop of the 2-year Treasury. So what the benchmarks do for the city's portfolio is set a comparison, and what the city looks at is if there's a substantial divergence from these benchmarks, that would prompt a reassessment of the investment strategy altogether. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation with the recommendation that Finance Committee recommend the council accept and approve the third quarter investment report and fiscal agent for fiscal year 2020. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Prilla. Any questions from my colleagues? Anything you want to add, Ms. Tomaszewski?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point. Good afternoon, Jennifer Tomaszewski, the Interim Finance Director. I just wanted to chime in off of Mr. Parilla. I was sorry about that. Committee member Harmon had asked about the liquidity and who makes the decisions on the investments. I just wanted to jump in on that and respond that we don't, as part of our policy, we have multiple layers of signature that are required for any investment. So for any one investment we take, it actually requires 3 signatures to, two signatures of approval along with Mr. Parilla's review in purchasing any of those investments. And currently, because of the COVID crisis, we have taken a pause on purchasing additional investments. So as those investments are maturing, just to ensure that we have the proper liquidity right now, we are holding on to that cash. Usually we do try to diversify our investment portfolio and spread the purchases over securities as well as LAIF. LAIF is the state investment fund. It still collects, it's more like a, I guess money market fund as far as accessibility. It's a mutual fund. So we have overnight access to that cash, and we've determined that our best approach right now is to maximize the amount that we're allowed to maintain in the LAIF fund, which is 75 million, as well as our checking. So as those maturities do come in right now, we're just currently pausing any purchases at this point. Hopefully that answers a little bit more of the question she asked.
Thank you for that clarification. That's an important point. Any questions from my colleagues to any of this? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, is there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item?
Chair, there are no members of the public who wish to speak on this item.
Okay, so I do need a recommendation to accept and approve the investment report and forward to council. Is there a motion and a second to the motion from my colleagues?
I move staff recommendations.
Is there a second?
I second it.
Great. The roll call vote, please, Ms. Clerk.
Chair Friedman?
Yes.
Councilmember Harmon?
Yes.
And Councilmember Alejandra Gutierrez?
Yes.
All right.
Motion carries.
Passes unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Parilla. And apologize if I'm saying your name incorrectly, but thank you for your great work on that. And that closes that item. And we are on to item number 3, recommendation on the use of reserves for the fiscal year 2021 budget. And Mr. Sewell, I see you are ready to go.
Indeed, I am. Thank you very much, Chair Friedman and Finance Committee members. My name is Mark Sewell. I'm the Accounting Manager for the City of Santa Barbara. And I have a presentation for you today to share with you some of the impacts of the recent COVID pandemic on the general fund reserves. And it's a good thing actually that you've just had the presentation from Mr. Parilla around cash, because, you know, I wanted to just take the opportunity to distinguish the difference between cash and reserves. Reserves really is the difference between the revenues and expenditures of a fund, and the cash is just a portion of the reserve. So as I go through the presentation, I'd ask you to jump in with any questions you have, and I'll do my best to try to explain the difference between cash and reserves as we move forward. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the outline of this presentation is to describe why do we have a reserve policy, what considerations are taken into account, what the current City of Santa Barbara policy is as set by council, and then to hone in on the general fund reserves, discuss a little about the enterprise fund reserves, and of course then discuss what we currently think the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to be to those reserves. Next slide, please. So again, what are reserves? They are the funds accumulated over time, being the difference between all of the revenues and all of the expenditures for each of the funds. And we separate each of the funds. They have their own legal status for enterprise funds, for example, and we can't commingle those funds. And it's often referred to as many other names. And so, fund balance, or you can think of it from a personal or from a private, angle of net worth. And those terms could be used interchangeably, but for the purposes of this presentation and generally how we refer to them, we call them as reserves. Next slide, please. Okay, so purposes for a reserve policy is that we obviously need to set goals and make sure for times like now that the city is able to continue to function. And we obviously need to articulate what that is and have the discussion about what is the appropriate level. And we need to make sure that as a finance department with the city that we are keeping our council informed and the public informed of how are we doing with regards to our reserve policy with our actual performances. And without a policy, you could probably lead yourself down a line where you end up not having any money when you absolutely need it. And so, we've been conservative and we've been challenging in terms of the desire to want to put more money into budgets and spend more on services and on needs of the public. But of course, trying to keep some money into the funds for a rainy day, sometimes it rains, and of course now it's raining. The reserves were designed to be used during events such as the COVID-19 pandemic, if that's not an obvious statement. And so this presentation will share some of the magnitude of that. So when considering a reserve policy, one has to look at the environment to which the organization resides. And one of those things is obviously the external and physical environment. How likely is it that the agency is going to be suffering an extreme event? Now, unfortunately, Santa Barbara has had more than its fair share over the recent past and may likely continue to see them in the future. So therefore, that will make a decision point around, well, what level of funding should we have just in case? If something's more likely, you might want to consider to have a little more. Revenue stability, of course, we are a tourist destination, and we're seeing the impacts of that right now. So again, our vulnerability to our key revenue streams, of which the city, with TOT tax being a significant portion of our annual revenues, along with sales tax, we may be more likely to feel the impact of this quickly or more quickly than other agencies who may be more funded from a property tax scenario. Then, of course, we move down to, well, what do we spend our money on and how volatile is that? Are we likely to see very large bills come in for various reasons? Well, what if we just don't worry about a reserve and we'll just go and get a loan, okay? Those are other things that you factor into it and say, do you know what? Well, maybe depending on the cause of the issue, maybe financing might be very expensive or not available, depending on what the banks are doing. Again, liquidity is a factor. We want to make sure that we have sufficient reserves in place. And to Mr. Pereira's last presentation's point and Mr. Tomaszewski, we want to make sure we've got enough liquidity or basically available cash to be able to pay the ongoing operations. And then, what do we think is going to happen over the next few years? It's something that happens a lot in the private sector. Sometimes companies grow too fast and they can't actually keep up with it, and they end up running out of cash, and it's called overtrading. Less likely to be the case in a municipal environment, but it's still worth figuring in. And then finally, one of the other major considerations is, well, what capital projects have we got? And we see this perhaps a little more in the enterprise funds, where they may be looking to save up for a significant project. And by means save up, I mean then, use the excess of revenues that they've received in one fiscal year, put it into a specific reserve. And there may also be requirements for debt that they've received to be able pay for certain capital projects which require, you know, the specific allocation of some funds to be able to make sure that those debt repayments can be made in future. So there's often a legal requirement as well. Next slide, please. So pulling out from what the city's current reserve policy is, there are 6 of them. And the main body of this reserve policy was put in place in 2012 under Resolution 12066. And then it was amended in 2018 under 2018-056. It was only a very minor amendment. So again, the main body of this was in 12066. The minor amendment was regarding the Facilities Management Fund. So as I say, 95% of the reserve policy has been in place since 2012. And I'll just go through them in order. The first reserve that was approved by or adopted by council was to hold a disaster reserve. And this applies to all general fund and all enterprise funds and is calculated on the basis of 15% of next year's adopted budget. There are some other little wrinkles in there where we can remove certain costs that aren't actually really operating, but that's the main gist of it, to have 15% of next year's budget in a disaster reserve. I'll go on future slides about, well, what does it mean and why would we use those particular categories? The second reserve is a contingency reserve. And again, general fund and enterprise funds required to have this, whereby it's 10%. So when we use the term fully funded reserves, what we really mean is that the combination of the disaster reserve and the contingency reserve is at least 25% in the general fund context. Again, fully funded general fund reserves would mean that we have 25% of next year's adopted budget sitting there in our books. Next slide, please. The third of these policies relates to enterprise capital funds. And we have to do a little bit of maths here. And we work out, okay, we need to have in reserve 5% of the net capital asset value, which is basically an accounting value of the expected life of each asset, and it's depreciated over time. And we then take 5% of that and say, okay. And so for some of our capital intensive funds, this can be quite a large number. For example, water fund has a lot of capital assets. Or we can look at the average of the last 3 or 5 years worth of capital expenditure. And really, we look at that in consultation with the managers and directors who have those enterprise funds, and we take the appropriate number and use that to provide for capital in future. The one exception to this is that the waterfront fund, per resolution from 1999, does have a minimum $2 million capital requirement for the Harbour Preservation Capital Fund and a goal of achieving $5 million. And so that really plays out that we technically can't say there are any available reserves in the operating fund for the waterfront until the Harbour Preservation Capital Fund has in excess of $5 million. Next slide, please. Then our fourth policy relates to internal service funds. And these are funds that primarily provide services to other city funds. So an example would be our IT department or our fleet department or our risk management department. And they have a different requirement. They do not have to have 25% in reserve because in some senses, we're already reserving a portion of that from the enterprise and the general fund, who are ultimately the customers of the internal service funds. But we don't have them with no reserve whatsoever because, again, they do have operations and they do need the ability to occasionally dip into their reserves without the need to then increase the internal revenues they require from the general fund or the enterprise funds. And that's 10% of next year's adopted budget, with the exception of the fleet fund. That does not have the 10% requirement. The fifth policy relates to an appropriated reserve. And so within the general fund, this is $150,000, which is adopted as part of the annual budget, and it hasn't really got a specific line. It's not at the point of doing the budget called out for a specific reason, and it's there for the use as deemed appropriate by the city administration to fund something that wasn't considered or had come up as part of the fiscal year. And then again, within the enterprise and internal service funds, they take 0.5 of their budget and load that into their adopted budget for the same types of things. And of course, that dollar value depends on the size of the enterprise fund. Next slide, please. And then the final policy that was set back in 2012 relates to the allocation of any year-end surplus within the general fund only. This slide is a little wordy, and I'll do my best to kind of just summarize it. The intent here was that for any fiscal year where the general fund revenue exceeded the general fund expenditures, that surplus would be used to put 50% into the reserves and transfer 50% into the general fund capital to be able to augment the general fund capital program. Up until the point that the general fund would be fully funded. And remember, that's at the point where the general fund has 25% of next year's operating budget set aside. At which point, the policy at that time was to, and currently, is to transfer all of the surplus to the capital fund again, to augment that capital fund. Next slide, please. So then we bring it into the recent history. Fiscal year 2019, as was presented as part of the comprehensive annual financial report and other interim reports that the finance is taken to Finance Committee and Council. Fiscal year 19 actually ended with a general fund surplus of $2.1 million. And before all of the COVID pandemic impact to revenues for the general fund, we as finance staff and the city were going to be recommending that only 25, and I say only because it's less than the current policy of 50%, be transferred to capital in fiscal year 20. And some of the rationale for that was that when you looked at the FY19 surplus and actually drilled into what created that $2.1 million, it really was primarily driven by a timing issue of receipts of sales tax revenue from the state of California. If you look back to FY18, the year before, we had a similar deficit of about $2 million. And that timing issue with them changing their tax systems basically left us with a big loss in one year and a big gain in another. And so when you added the 2 years together, really, we were pretty much expenditures and revenues in line. And so therefore, the other piece of information is that fiscal year 19, and I'll come on to this in a future slide, the general fund wasn't fully funded. And so there was going to be a recommendation to still honor the principle of the existing policy, but maybe just question whether the full 50% should be transferred to capital, when really, had there not been an impact at the state for delayed taxes, we wouldn't have ever had a surplus. Moving forward, well, everything's really changed in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And now we're really saying, do you know what? Would it be more sensible and advisable to just leave all of that 2.1 million in the general fund, given that, and again, you'll see it on some charts in a minute, we think we're very, very likely to need to use some of the disaster reserves in the general fund. Next slide, please. So here is a chart for the last 15 years. And we go back to 2005 because I wanted to be able to present kind of where were we before the Great Recession. And the blue bars represent the disaster, the darker blue is the disaster fund, that's the 15th disaster reserve, I'm sorry, in the general fund. That represents the 15% of the future year's budget. And the light blue bar is the contingency, which represents 10%. And then where you can see, I guess I'll call it peach, maybe, where you can see the peach bars, and they're actually below the zero line, that's showing you that for most fiscal years, the city has actually had a shortfall. It hasn't been fully funded, okay? In 2005, it was very small, very, very small. And you can see that as well by the gray bar. The gray bar, sorry, gray line, I'm sorry. The gray line represents the policy of where we were hopeful that the city would be at the end of each fiscal year. Now, of course, what happened from 2005 through to 2015 was there was probably what we considered was hopefully going to be the largest recession any of us would have to live through. May not be the case. But of course, that significantly impacted the city's revenues, and you can see what it did to the city's reserve policy. policy reserves, in the sense that to balance the budget each year, the city had to use contingency reserves. And that's why you see only a sliver of the light blue in fiscal year 8 and fiscal year 9. And you start to see it grow over time as the city began to adopt budgets that actually enabled it to rebuild the reserves. Now, within the policy itself of that resolution I mentioned, there are specific rules around how we are supposed to use reserves and then how we're supposed to try to rebuild reserves. And you can see the city was successful between fiscal year 06 to fiscal year 15 and 16. It used the reserves for the reason that the reserves were there and was able to, in fiscal year 16, become fully funded. Over the last few years, the contingency reserve has been used a little bit. And part of that issue, part of the challenge there, of course, is that you see that gray line keeps going up pretty much. It's always a relative target based on a future budget, which tends typically to be a higher operating cost as we deal with inflation and other issues. And obviously, typically, we hope our revenues will also grow to offset some of that. What I want to just say as well, included in these reserves is $8 million in loans that the general fund in fiscal year 19 issued to the airport fund and to the Measure C fund. Next slide, please. So I want to remind you of a slide that Ms. Tomaszewski shared with you, I think it was on April 21st, when, of course, information was very challenging there. It's still challenged to really know where we are. And I guess I would just confirm that at this stage, we aren't aware of anything massively significant that wants us to kind of come off of the numbers that Ms. Tomaszewski prepared and presented a couple of weeks back. Of course, we literally have no clue whether this is exactly how everything's going to pan out, because it's so uncertain how the city is going to be able to recover and reopen in line with all of the guidance that's going to come from the county and the state and the federal level. But at this stage, we're still planning and using these types of numbers. And I guess what I would point to here is that, if you look at the policy reserves at the end of 19, we were at about $33 million. We do think there's going to be at a 12 million roughly, could plus or minus, 1 or 2 million. And we think we're going to end fiscal year 20 with about $20 to $21 million in reserves. That's pretty much going to expend all of our contingency reserves. And this is why I'm saying we may end up this fiscal year, and certainly by the looks of it for next fiscal year, requiring the use of disaster reserves. The major thing I want you to remember about this slide is that this was a do nothing scenario, which of course the city is not in any way advocating or promoting. But we wanted to try to just get this out there and remind you that this is a very, very significant revenue dent to the fund. And the fund goes into this pandemic pretty healthy with $33 million in reserves. But given the nature of this, it could have a very significant impact on revenues, and we'll come on to what the city's looking to do about that, and obviously take your guidance as well. Next slide, please. So here is exactly the same chart. The differences are now unhidden fiscal year 20 and 21. And the reason why I wanted to go back and show you from FY 05, 06, 07, and back at the time, again, I remember I was very early in my career, but this is the worst recession we've ever had, the Great Recession, et cetera, et cetera. And the city managed to navigate that with a $10 million worst, unfunded reserve position in fiscal year 08. And you can see that we're projecting for fiscal year 20 to smash through that. The chart here on 21, it kind of follows a little bit the assumption of the do nothing previous slide. And of course, the city again is not planning to do nothing. We would hope that some of the mitigating ideas and processes that were already begun and are commencing will reduce the size of that, I guess what I'll call that like a clay brick color, reduce the size of that deficit in fiscal year 21. But there really is little we can do to reduce the size of that that clay color on fiscal year 20, given we are now on the 12th of May, and this thing came and hit us very, very hard. Next slide, please. So what are we doing to try to address the financial impacts? And so I apologize if some of this is going to be repetitive from what you've already heard. And I know that the city administrator has been very consistent in his communications to council and to city staff. You know, we are currently holding, I think there's over 100 vacant positions across the city. They're not all in the general fund, but we are holding many, many vacant positions open. And clearly that has the impact of reducing our expenditures. It does also have another knock-on impact of, you know, requiring those who are working to maybe pick up a bit of slack, or in some cases, it means we aren't delivering certain services. We're reducing and or delaying capital expenditures because, again, that's normally significant amounts of money that, while there is often an impact, a negative impact to delaying, it's probably a least worse action to take at this point in time, something that can be quickly turned on and off in some cases. And of course, as I've already mentioned, we are using reserves, and it's likely that most funds will use reserves as a result of the COVID outbreak. And then what are we going to be doing going forward? And so really the thrust of this presentation was to have your mind cast forward to fiscal year 21. And I know you will be receiving lots of presentations as a council from departments who will be able to go into more detail about what it means for them specifically. But, you know, again, hopefully none of these are surprises, but unfortunately they are disappointing. The reduction in services is going to be absolutely necessary if we are going to save money. It's just impossible to offer the same level of services at the same, while making the savings we're going to need to make. You know, we're going to be looking at everything in a new light. We are in a new world. The great ideas of 6 months ago are still great ideas, but are they now great ideas in a pandemic environment? Those are the kind of the things that we'll be looking internally and looking for council direction on. Labor agreements. We are a municipal organization with many, many bargaining units. And as Mr. Casey has mentioned, we're pleased that they are coming to the table. But those things take time and there's nothing guaranteed there. This next item, of course, is in italics because, again, it's even less certain. There may or may not be state or federal relief, which could significantly impact the way in which the city would respond to this COVID outbreak. We are planning at this point in time that there might not be, and we have to have that plan. And you know, what the saying I think, and I hope I don't butcher this, is plan for the worst and hope for the best, of course. And so that's currently where we are. I would just add that we're very grateful to the federal government because as part of the CARES Act, airports were specifically singled out for support, and I believe the airport has received or will be receiving $9.5 million in grant funding to maintain its operations, and that will be very much needed to support the financial condition of the airport going forward. The final bullet point here is that this is a FEMA declared disaster. Typically, and I have no reason to think that it won't be typical in this case again, but we'll hope. Typically, the recovery of costs there tend to be just that, costs. Additional expenditures to repair physical items such as bridges, roadways, buildings, that type of thing. There is no provision that I'm aware of at this point in time where there's a loss of revenue, and that's by far the biggest impact of this current COVID pandemic as we are talking on May the 12th. So we kind of just have to eat that at this point in time unless there is some additional state and federal relief. And I'll just add the final note that we don't have any current insurance policies that will be a get out of jail free card here that will suddenly, awash us with $10 million to cover our losses that we are projecting in revenue. Next slide, please. So I mentioned to you earlier when I went through the 6 different reserves that were put into policy by council back in 2012. And I wanted to pull out disaster reserves because, as I mentioned, we're kind of already expecting we're going to use all of the contingency reserves. Contingency reserves will need to be rebuilt over time. That's part of the policy. But I wanted to just let you know that even with some of the mitigating factors that we are looking to put in place, there's no guarantee that we won't need to go into disaster reserves. The resolution calls out for the use of disaster reserves during a natural disaster. I guess it's pretty obvious in the name, right? That caused significant damage to the city. And it's been written in such a way that that's what typical disasters have always been in the past and will probably be in the future. There is, however, room in the policy to apply it to the COVID pandemic because it is primarily for state and federally declared disasters. And I don't think there's ever been more of a federally declared disaster than the COVID pandemic. So I don't think we have an legal issue about using the disaster reserves per se, but of course, it is our last resort of available money to be able to run the operations for the general fund. Next slide, please. So enterprise funds, I've only got a couple slides. Don't worry, I haven't got the same amount of time for enterprise funds as I went through general fund. But again, we calculate reserves at the end of each fiscal year, and they are audited, and we report them, and we have to categorize them. And we can do projections based on where we think their revenues and expenditures are going to be for a fiscal year. And I want you also to realize, and I've got a slide coming up, that not all enterprise funds had reserves above policy at the end of the last fiscal year. So of course, the negative impact of the COVID pandemic is only going to make that challenge a little harder. Next slide, please. So here's where we were, and I apologize for the amount of numbers, although I appreciate them. I know some people get turned off by a page of numbers. I just wanted to kind of remind you of where we were last fiscal year. And then there is a column on here, the fourth column along, which said, well, if they actually hit the budget and they did what they said they were going to do, where would they have ended fiscal year 20? And so the column that's being highlighted at the moment of FY19 available, that's where we started this fiscal year. And again, available reserves means you've met your policy requirements, you've got your disaster reserve covered, you've got your contingency reserve covered, you've got any capital reserve covered, you've got your appropriated reserve in there. This is now money that you've got to go and do anything you want with, subject to it being, approved and agreed with by the policymakers within the remit of the fund that you operate. So, for example, Water Fund had $8 million of of available money to go and spend in the water department on something that was going to help the water department. Typically, though, when you see those numbers in parentheses below it, well, there's often a policy discussion that says, well, you're not fully funded yet, so maybe you shouldn't think about going and doing something which is perhaps a little more discretionary in nature. And how are you actually going to try and get yourself to a fully funded status? And so as you look down there for the different funds, you can see, well, for a start, they're very, very different in magnitude and size, and they all have a varying reserve position as at the end of fiscal year 19, and then an updated position as at the end of fiscal year 20. Now, of course, enterprise funds aren't ignoring COVID. They are significantly affected, and they are looking at their revenues and their expenditures. And I would anticipate that the end of fiscal year 20 is going to look a little bit different to what was projected at the start of this year. And we'll know more about that as we progress and wrap up those books. And again, I think each department will be taking its time to share with you its plans and give you its views on how the enterprise funds are likely to perform financially with regards to the COVID. Next slide, please. So this is, I think, the last slide, or very close to. This is the last slide, yes. We're looking, to basically communicate where we think we are and what is likely to happen, even though none of us have the crystal ball that we'd like to have. And we just don't know for certain how big the losses are going to be. But we do recommend, and we want you to be aware of, we are looking at department reductions in the general fund and also where appropriate in the enterprise funds where their revenues are impacted of 5%. In addition to that, we are discussing with labor unions about how they can help us to offset this significant revenue reduction. We have looked at our general fund capital program and we are looking to delay and reduce. And we've also, as I mentioned before, recommending not to transfer any of the fiscal year, the prior year, that's what the PY means, the prior year surplus of the general fund to the capital, trying to maintain as much of the general fund reserves as possible. We do hope, and we are engaged and influencing and trying to encourage state and federal assistance. It's not guaranteed, of course. And as mentioned, the final piece is the reserves. And so we are looking to fill the gap with reserves until more information is known. And as Mr. Casey has mentioned before, we are working on an assumption that we might have to keep looking at this as we learn more over time And it's very unlikely that business as usual and having an annual budget and then kind of tweaking it around the edges is going to be sufficient for the next 12 to 18 months as we hope that the city, the state, the country, and the world can kind of get back to some sense of normality. But with that, that's the end of my presentation. And I appreciate there was a lot there, and I thank you for kind of letting me finish it, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Sewell. I'll open up to questions from my colleagues. Ms. Councilmember Gutierrez or Harmon, do you have any questions at this point before I open it up for public comments? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, is there any public comment on these items?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pinch hitting for the previous clerk. We do have one person as an attendee. Mr. Fankner, if you're looking to speak, could you raise your hand? I don't see any public comment, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I will close public comment to this and we'll come back. So I'll start off since I don't see from my colleagues. I want to thank you for the presentation, Mr. Sewell. It's very sobering news on what we need to do and the struggles that we're going to face as a city going forward with this. In terms of the item generally before us on the use of reserves, my understanding from your presentation is that for this fiscal year, due to how late it is, that we are basically going to need to use the entire contingency, the 10% contingency. Is that my understanding correct, Mr. Sewell?
Chair Friedman, I think that is a very, very real possibility, yes.
Okay, so with that, that gets us to the point where it would open up the possibility based on the policies we have in place to go into the disaster reserves. And I think that we do need to go into them because this is a disaster. But in light of the unknowns, whether from labor concessions, from state and federal assistance or other sources to balance out the revenue, I don't know if today, actually I don't believe today would be a good time to pin a number, but I think for the full council consideration, what we would need to understand is what is a number that we need to maintain in our reserves to respond to the issues that you raised later of a potential fire, earthquake, or some type of other natural disaster, and have that. The other thing I think we also need to be cognizant of is that we also need to plan out to fiscal year 22, 23, but in particular 22, so we have a better understanding of what the numbers are, because we might have to use reserves the following year as well, depending on that. So when you're looking at, to the extent that we can, at least a 2 to 3 year out, not just for fiscal year 21, but at least fiscal year 22, how much in reserves would you anticipate that we would need to use? And I don't expect an answer today, but these are all questions I think we as a council will need to understand in terms of what is the baseline that we can dip into the emergency reserves and still have the level of service and staffing that we need to provide a level of service. So those are my comments. I'll open it up again to my colleagues. Actually, you know, I do see a public comment that came in from Mr. Ford. So Councilman Harmon, if you could hold that, I'm gonna open up to the public comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. We have one public comment, Mr. Fankner. Mr. Fankner, if you could turn down the volume on your television and unmute yourself. I'm gonna unmute you. Then if you can unmute yourself, you'll have 3 minutes to speak. Go ahead, Mr. Fankner.
Great. Hello, can you hear me okay? Great, thank you. Thank you. So I had a couple questions. The first was in terms of the staff recommendations. There was a slide that was just up there. I don't know if it's possible to put up the slide while I'm speaking. But I had a question as to the number of recommendations that were placed up there. There was one that I didn't see. And that would be a 30% pay reduction for the top 10 city staff. Was that considered? And if so, why wasn't it included in that list? And then secondly, in terms of the reduction of services, are there any plans out there to provide a private alternative to some of the services which traditionally the city has provided? And here I'm specifically thinking of the Los Baños pool. Is there any discussions or flexibility in opening the pool under some type of agreement with nonprofit or other entity to provide services? And this is kind of broader for city services that need to be reduced. So thank you very much for your time and for your consideration of these questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fankner. Appreciate your comments. Staff has taken note. I don't have an answer for you today on that, but so now I'll open it up to my colleagues. I saw earlier, Councilwoman Harmon, you had, I guess, turn your light on or turn your camera on, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. No, I wanted to wholeheartedly echo your comments, really all of them. This is quite sobering, but I do agree, it doesn't feel productive in this moment to try to set the percentage of disaster reserves that we will use. But I did, want to acknowledge, certainly as you did, Chair Friedman, that this is a disaster. That is why we have these reserves, and it's inevitable that we will need to use some portion, and similarly echo how helpful it would be for me in thinking about these decisions, if we could get some feedback really on what sort of the baseline we really need is, and what that's going to look like moving forward. That would truly be so helpful in us moving forward. And then I just had a question for you, Mr. Chair. Are we voting on this item today, or is this just receiving a report?
I looked at it, and I think we do need to vote on the recommendation. About Mr. Casey, can you help me out there? The way the agenda reads, it looks like we do need to give a recommendation, but I don't know if we need to take an actual vote on it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and commission members. I think we just wanted to get your feedback and kind of input, which is what you're doing, so that's helpful. I agree with you that I don't think it's prudent at this time to peg an actual number. We wanted to kind of let you know our mindset and see if we were kind of in sync with yours, and I think we are. First, credit to yours and prior councils to having essentially fully funded contingency and disaster reserves. That is really helping us out, and having close to 25% of an operating budget in reserves is a pretty substantial number that we were able to maintain and have discipline for it. So that is good news. And then I agree with you that we're in a disaster, so I think prudently using some of the disaster reserves is appropriate, but still maintaining some for other future rainy days. Reserves are supposed to help you bridge a gap until you kind of right size the organization for the new normal. And the problem we have is we don't know 6 months, a year, 2 years from now what that new normal is going to be. So I think prudently using some reserves until we right size the organization to where it needs to be is appropriate. And so we'll bring some recommendations back to you all. What is the right number to have kind of in your back pocket in this scenario for reserves? It's a policy question. It's a judgment call on all our parts as to what that right number is. And so we'll give you some suggestions and look forward to getting your feedback on that.
Thank you, Councilman Harmon. Do you have any further questions or comments? See, you clicked off. Councilmember Gutierrez, did you have any questions or comments?
Not at this moment, thank you.
So, Mr. Casey, just one last thing before we wrap up. You got the kind of direction that we're thinking from finance here to give you some direction in terms of building your budgets and coming to council with the different departments. Is there anything else that you need from us today to give you further direction? It seems like the reserves, the direction we gave and recommendations is pretty clear. Anything else?
I would agree with that. I appreciate you taking the time and digging deep into it, because it's an important policy that we've had, and unfortunately, we're really going to be testing it right now through this crisis.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Casey. Thank you to staff. With that, I will adjourn, nothing on the agenda, adjourn this meeting of the Finance Committee.